What if I told you some of the juiciest scandals of the Middle Ages never made it into your history books? Not because they weren't important, not because they didn't happen, but because King Jaeus, actual kings, ordered them erased. Affairs that rattled kingdoms, secret romances between royals and commoners, betrayals so shocking they could topple dynasties, stories so explosive that armies were razed, reputations destroyed, and families ripped apart, and yet they were buried, scratched out of manuscripts, torn from chronicles, silenced by decree. But here's the thing about love: it refuses to stay buried. It lingers. It survives, hidden in dusty footnotes, whispered in rumors, preserved in the ballads of minstrels who sang what chroniclers dared not write. Picture this: a candlelit scriptorium. A monk bends over a parchment, quill scratching steadily. He pauses, hesitates, and then scratches out a name. He thinks he's erased the scandal forever. But centuries later, under the right light, the ghost of those letters reappears. The truth flickers through. The love that was forbidden refuses to vanish. That's what we're diving into. This is not the sanitized version of history, not the polished portraits of kings draped in velvet, queens sitting serenely with hands folded. This is the messy version, the human version, the one your history teacher definitely skipped because medieval rulers wanted us to see them as divine, God's chosen instruments on earth, impossibly dignified, infallible, beyond the reach of petty human weakness. But guess what? They weren't. They were people, with tempers, with jealousy, with desires they couldn't control. And sometimes those desires burned hotter than crowns, stronger than armies, and more dangerous than any foreign invader. Imagine a queen sneaking through torchlit corridors to meet a forbidden lover, a king writing a letter not to his council, but to the one person he really couldn't live without. Imagine the panic when a servant finds it, delivers it to the wrong hand, and suddenly the fate of a dynasty hangs on a love note. Scandalous. Absolutely. But it's also revealing, because these stories show us the truth. Rulers tried to hide that behind the thrones, the treaties, the crowns of gold. There were just human hearts, hearts that fluttered, stumbled, and sometimes dragged entire kingdoms down with them. And the irony: the harder kings tried to erase the scandals, the louder they became. Erase a name from the record, people whisper it twice as loud. Burn the letters, the memory of them spreads faster. Execute the lovers. Congratulations, you've just created martyrs whose stories will outlive your throne. That's why we're here, to peel back the layers of dust, to look past the official version, to find the stories hidden between the lines, the romances too dangerous to record, but too irresistible to forget. These aren't fairy tales. They don't end with happily. In fact, most end with betrayal, exile, or a very dramatic public execution. But they do end with something more powerful: mortality. Because forbidden love may be punished, it may be silenced, it may be erased from the page, but it always survives in the story. So buckle up, we're about to open the medieval gossip column no one wanted you to read. The one with kings sneaking out of castles, queens caught in the act, and lovers whose passion was dangerous enough to rewrite history. Power fades, thrones crumble, crowns gather dust, but scandal lives forever. Picture this: a sprawling medieval castle, stone walls rising against a gray sky, banners snapping in the wind, the sound of bells tolling from a distant cathedral, the clatter of hooves in the courtyard, the murmur of courtiers plotting in the shadows. This is the world of medieval kingship, grand, heavy, and if you think it's all fairy tale romance and happily ever after, think again. Because in this world, marriage wasn't about love, not even close. Marriage was about power, about land, about armies, about who had the bigger treasury and the sharper quill to sign a treaty. Forget flowers and moonlit serenades weddings where battlefields fought in velvet and lace, with signatures instead of swords. Every royal marriage was a chess move, a pawn sacrificed, a queen advanced, a king defended. Every alliance meant land gained, borders secured, or enemies appeased. When a prince married a princess, it wasn't for passion, it was for politics. Think of it like medieval diplomacy wrapped up in white gowns and gold crowns. And yet, behind those iron gates, behind the velvet curtains of royal halls, the human heart still beat. And hearts, as history has proven over and over again, do not care about treaties. Now, imagine being a king or a queen bound by duty, smothered by expectations. Your entire life plotted out since birth, who you will marry, what heirs you must produce, which alliances you must uphold. Imagine the claustrophobic weight of that crown, pressing down not just on your head, but on your very soul. And then picture the irresistible temptation of someone who sees you, not your title. Someone who makes you laugh, who makes you feel alive, who makes you forget that your very existence is a political contract. That's scandal waiting to ignite. And here's the thing, kings knew it. They feared it. They dreaded it. Forbidden love wasn't just a matter of gossip. It was a ticking time bomb. Because one wrong romance, one secret affair, one affair of the heart, could topple dynasties, fracture alliances, and send kingdoms plunging into war. This wasn't about heartbreak. This was about survival. Let's pause for a second. Think about how different that is from today. We swipe left, we swipe right, we ghost, we text you up at 2 a.m., but in the medieval world, every romantic choice was a high-stakes gamble with armies on the line. It wasn't, does he like me? It was, will this marriage keep France from invading? Or, if I don't produce an heir, will my cousin's cousin stage a coup? Tinder, please. Imagine every swipe came with a treaty attached. Now, the rules of this deadly game were clear. A royal marriage was sacred, binding, untouchable. But here's the hypocrisy. Mistresses. Lovers. Oh, those were practically expected. As long as they didn't interfere with politics, of course. If a king kept a mistress quietly, if a queen enjoyed the company of a discreet confidant well, the courtiers might whisper, but the realm stayed steady. It was the forbidden love the affairs that turned serious, that threatened heirs, that broke the rules of lineage, that sent shockwaves through kingdoms. So, here's the paradox. Kings were absolute rulers, yes. They commanded armies, minted coins, crushed rebellions, but they could not command their own hearts. And that terrified them. Picture Edward II of England, torn between his throne and his favorite companion, Piers Gaveston. Picture Louis XIV, whose string of mistresses wielded more influence than half his ministers. Picture queens caught in whispered scandals, courtiers risking everything for one stolen kiss. Each story reminds us that even behind the gilded mask of power, there was always something raw, something uncontrollable, desire. Now, let's add another layer of pressure: dynasties, bloodlines. For medieval monarchs, the most sacred duty was to secure the line of succession, to produce heirs and spares, and preferably spares for the spares. A king falling in love with the wrong person wasn't just a personal embarrassment, it was a direct threat to the legitimacy of the crown itself. If a child was suspected of being illegitimate, the entire royal lineage could unravel. Nobles would whisper, alliances would fracture, wars would ignite. That's why love was dangerous. Think about it. If you're a king, your throne is only as steady as your reputation, and nothing destroys a reputation faster than scandal. So, kings clamped down hard. Chroniclers were ordered to forget embarrassing details. Poets were silenced. Letters were burned. Lovers were exiled or worse. The crown was ruthless in its attempts to erase anything that might tarnish the spotless image of royal authority. But here's the delicious irony. The harder kings tried to erase these stories, the more irresistible they became, the more scandalous, the more whispered, the more immortal. It's like trying to delete your search history and realizing everyone already took screenshots. The medieval world was no different. So here we are, standing at the edge of this world where love and power constantly collide. On one side, cold, calculated political marriages alliances, sealed with rings, not roses. On the other side, fiery, reckless passion, burning in shadows, hidden in torchlit hallways, smuggled in secret letters, and the stakes. Monumental dot, because forbidden love wasn't just a private affair. It wasn't just two people sneaking glances across a banquet hall. It was the crack in the wall that could bring down an entire kingdom. Picture this again. A candlelit feast in a great hall, hundreds of nobles watching, every move scrutinized. The king raises a goblet, his queen at his side, all smiles for the crowd. But across the table, a pair of eyes meet his for just a second too long. A subtle smile, a fleeting glance, and suddenly the rumors start. Whispers spread faster than wildfire. Who is she? Who is he? What does it mean for the throne? This was the medieval reality. Every gesture, every touch, every smile could become a weapon. Every romance, a political earthquake. And here's the final twist of this opening act. The kings knew it. They feared it. And yet they could not stop it. Because no matter how heavy the crown, no matter how fortified the castle, no matter how many laws or punishments or exiles they handed down, they couldn't control the one thing that always slipped through their fingers: love. So, as we step into these stories, these forbidden love stories, medieval kings tried so hard to remember the stakes. This wasn't just gossip. This wasn't just rumor. This was survival. Thrones hung in the balance. Dynasties trembled. Wars were fought. Alliances broken. Blood spilled. All because someone dared to follow their heart. And that's the irony. Kings could command armies. They could silence their enemies. They could erase pages from history. But they could never erase desire. So buckle up, because the world we're about to step into isn't one of fairy tale romances. It's a world where every kiss was dangerous, every love letter a crime, and every affair a story powerful enough to reshape kingdoms. Power fades, crowns rust, but forbidden love, that's eternal. Step deeper with me now into the iron machinery of medieval control. A world where kings claimed divine right, yet trembled at the very thought of love slipping outside their grasp, because love unplanned, unapproved, unregulated was a threat, a wildfire, and kings. Kings liked their world orderly, predictable, stamped with a royal seal. So how did they keep love on a leash? With contracts, with councils, with the weight of the church. Imagine walking into a vast cathedral, incense thick in the air, sunlight piercing stained glass windows. There, under the gaze of saints and martyrs, bishops scratched out marriage decrees with quills dipped in ink blacker than night. Every union catalogued, sanctified, approved by holy authority. And if love didn't fit the paperwork, too bad, it wasn't marriage. It wasn't even allowed to exist. Royal marriages weren't about vows of affection. They were legal documents, the fine print of dynasties. They bound kingdoms together like glue or shackles. One treaty hidden in a kiss. One alliance disguised in a wedding feast. But here's the hypocrisy. While kings wrapped themselves in sermons about chastity, honor, and duty, they kept entire networks of mistresses tucked away in castles and country houses. Mistresses weren't just tolerated, they were practically part of the system. As long as they didn't interfere with heirs, they were the royal perk, the noble side dish to the main political entree. So here's the twisted rulebook. Approved passion, fine, acceptable, even celebrated in certain circles. A king's mistress might be gifted jewels, estates, even influence over court appointments. Everyone looked the other way because it was understood, but forbidden passion, that was dangerous. Forbidden passion meant a king or a prince falling in love, truly in love, with the wrong person. Not a fling, not a distraction. A relationship that threatened lineage, that risked producing children who might stake a claim to the throne. That was the real nightmare. Think about the absurdity. A king could have 5 mistresses, scatter children across the countryside, and everyone would politely ignore it. But if he dared to actually love one of them, suddenly the entire kingdom went into meltdown. What scared kings more? A rival army at the gates, or their son falling in love with the wrong woman? The answer was obvious. Love terrified them, because an invading army you could fight. You could march against it, crush it with steel. But love was invisible, insidious, impossible to legislate. It slipped past walls, ignored decrees, laughed at papal bulls. And it struck where kings were weakest, their families, their heirs, their carefully arranged dynastic chessboard. Let's paint the contrast clearly. Picture a candlelit cathedral, priests chanting. A bishop raises his hand in blessing as a young prince and foreign princess are bound together in matrimony, their smiles tight, their eyes wary. The whole ceremony feels like a business deal, cloaked in incense and silk. Now picture a smoky tavern at the edge of town. Commoners hunched over mugs of ale. A bard strums a lute, singing a sly ballad about the king's secret affair. Whispers pass like wildfire. Did you hear? He sneaks to her chambers at night. Did you hear? She's carrying his child. Those whispers, dangerous as daggers, carried more threat to the crown than any sword. The irony is almost laughable. Monarchs stood on balconies, preaching duty and morality to their subjects. Yet, behind closed doors, they bent those same rules, twisting them, to satisfy their desires. Kings who punished adultery in the streets hosted banquets for their mistresses. Queens who upheld chastity in sermons carried their own whispered scandals. The system was a theater of control, and the audience, the people, the nobles, the church played along until someone broke the script, until passion turned serious, until love crossed the line into politics. And when that happened, the machinery of power slammed into motion. Papal bulls condemning unions, councils convened to annul marriages, lovers exiled, imprisoned, sometimes executed. The church wrote the rules, the kings enforced them, and the people whispered about the hypocrisy in smoky taverns while pretending to obey. But here's the kicker. For all their efforts, the kings couldn't stop it. No matter how many decrees, no matter how many punishments, no matter how many marriages they orchestrated, love still slipped through. Secret letters still found their way into royal chambers. Stolen glances still turned into midnight meetings. Heirs still fell for the wrong partners. And kings still panicked because love was the one thing their iron machinery could not control. Think about that image for a second. Armies kneeling to the crown, gold pouring into treasuries, the Pope himself sending blessings across the land. And yet the crown shakes, not from rebellion, not from famine, not from war, but from love letters exchanged in the dark. It's both ridiculous and profound, and that's why this world feels so claustrophobic. Imagine being born into a system where your heart is not your own, where every glance is judged, every touch is measured, every rumor could become a weapon, where your father tells you who you'll marry before you've even learned how to read. And yet, somewhere inside, you still crave what everyone craves: affection, intimacy, someone who sees you not as a title, but as a person. That craving is dangerous. That craving is scandal. That craving is the crack in the wall of royal power. So kings built their fortresses of control higher. More contracts, more decrees, more punishments. They leaned on the church to sanctify marriages, to condemn lovers, to act as spiritual police over the desires of men and women who happened to wear crowns. But it never really worked, because love is relentless. You can exile it, burn it, silence it, bury it under law and parchment, but it grows back. In tavern songs, in court rumors, in chronicles that accidentally preserved more than they should have. And that's the hypocrisy that defined medieval kingship. A system designed to deny love, yet constantly undone by it. So, let me ask again, what scared kings more? A rival army they could crush with steel, or their son falling in love with the wrong woman? History already gave us the answer. And it's why we're still telling these stories centuries later. Now, let's pull back. Step away from the throne rooms, the contracts, the politics. Let's zoom out to see the bigger cultural picture. Because kings may have controlled armies, but they could never fully control the story. And stories, they have a way of surviving. Poets, chroniclers, and storytellers were the lifeblood of medieval memory. They wrote the songs, the records, the histories that outlived kings and their decrees. But here's the twist. They were also the censors, the erasers, the editors who decided which love stories got to live on and which ones were condemned to silence. Picture this: a monk bent over a manuscript by candlelight, carefully copying a chronicle. The scratch of his quill fills the silence. Then he pauses. He hovers. He scratches out a name. Maybe he tears an entire page. Why? Because the king demanded it. Because a scandal was too dangerous to survive in ink. Whole reputations were rewritten in this way. Lovers erased. Affairs denied. The official record scrubbed clean. But here's the delicious irony. Every attempt to erase a love story made it even juicier. When kings said, "Erase that affair," what they really meant was, "Future generations, please gossip about this forever." Because you can burn a letter, but you can't burn memory. You can tear out a page, but you can't tear out a rumor whispered at a tavern. You can order silence, but you can't stop a bard from singing a ballad in some smoky corner of the kingdom. And ballads, they were the true social media of the medieval world. Short, catchy, impossible to kill. A forbidden romance could vanish from the chronicles, but live on forever in a song sung by peasants, passed down through generations. A queen's secret lover, a prince's betrayal, all disguised as allegories about nightingales or hunting stags. Clever little codes that let everyone know exactly what was being talked about without daring to say it. Outright. Imagine a peasant humming a tune in the fields, completely unaware that the melody on his lips carried the shame of a king. That's how scandal survived, hidden in plain sight. And it wasn't just peasants. Nobles loved gossip even more. A scandalous story might not make it into the official royal chronicle, but it thrived in letters, in private diaries, in the knowing smirks exchanged across banquet tables. The court was a pressure cooker of secrets, and love stories were the spiciest fuel. Now, here's where it gets fascinating. Chroniclers weren't just neutral observers. They had agendas. They were paid, bribed, threatened. One historian might praise a king's piety and loyalty, while another whispered about his nightly escapades. Some went further, turning rumors into moral lessons. If a ruler wanted to discredit his rival, what better way than to accuse him of a scandalous affair? The line between history and propaganda blurred until you couldn't tell fact from weaponized rumor. Think about it. How many of the forbidden love stories we know today are truth, and how many were carefully planted lies? Was a queen truly unfaithful, or did her enemies invent the tale to weaken her power? Was a king's favorite companion really his lover, or just the target of jealous nobles eager to tarnish his reign? It's maddening, and yet it's irresistible, because, whether true or not, these stories stuck. They slipped past the gatekeepers of history. They survived in gossip, folklore, half-raced manuscripts, even coded allegories in plays and poems. They became myths too stubborn to die, and the very attempt to bury them made them stronger. Picture half-erased love letters, faint words still visible if you hold the parchment to the light. Picture manuscripts with torn corners, leaving you desperate to know what was missing. Picture folklore in villages where no one remembered the king's policies, but everyone remembered the scandal he tried to hide. This is the paradox of forbidden love in the medieval world. Officially, it was denied, censored, erased. Culturally, it was unforgettable. Why? Because people crave these stories. Always have, always will. They humanize the powerful. They cut through the pomp and the divine right to show kings and queens as vulnerable, messy, passionate humans. And nothing scares a ruler more than being remembered not for their victories, but for the affairs they tried to bury. So let's put ourselves in their shoes for a second. You're a king. You've fought wars, crushed rebellions, built cathedrals. You want to be remembered as great. But centuries later, historians barely mention your policies. What do they remember? Your mistress, your scandal, the affair you tried to erase. It's almost cruel, but it's poetic justice. And this brings us to the cultural paranoia that wrapped itself around love in the medieval world. Kings weren't just afraid of affairs because of bloodlines and politics. They were afraid of the story, afraid of how it would echo, afraid of how it would live on in ways they couldn't control, because armies could be defeated, enemies could be exiled, but a scandal was eternal. Picture walking through a ruined castle today, the walls crumbling, the banners long gone, the throne hall empty, and yet, in the whispers of tour guides, in the hushed voices of visitors, the love stories still live. Not the tax policies, not the treaties, the scandals, the affairs, the forbidden romances that kings tried to erase. That's the legacy of censorship. It doesn't kill, it immortalizes. So, by the end of this introduction, we see it all clearly. The politics, the paranoia, the hypocrisy, the desperate attempts to control hearts and stories alike, and yet the failure of it all. Because love, whispered in taverns, sung in ballads, scribbled in half-burned letters, proved stronger than power, stronger than crowns, stronger than censorship itself. And that's why we're still here, centuries later, ready to peel back the layers of dust, scandal, and silence, ready to uncover the stories they didn't want us to know. Because, in the end, when kings ordered history to forget, they guaranteed that we'd remember. Let's step right into the contradiction at the heart of medieval love. On one side, you had acceptable love, the kind neatly arranged on parchment, signed off by kings, queens, and popes. On the other, the dangerous, combustible kind. The kind that sneaked through shadows, hid in bedchambers, and threatened to shatter kingdoms. So, what exactly counted as acceptable in the eyes of the crown? Simple love that served a purpose. Love that came with land, gold, soldiers, or treaties attached. Royal marriages were essentially business contracts dressed up in lace and velvet. Think Wall Street deal-making, but with choirs singing and crowns glinting under candlelight. Picture it, a young princess, barely 15, shipped across borders to marry a prince she's never met. Their union sealed peace between rival families. Their wedding feast wasn't about their joy, was about everyone else's relief. Because a successful marriage meant a pause in bloodshed, a dowry delivered, a border secured. And if the bride and groom didn't exactly like each other, too bad, that was irrelevant. Affection didn't sign treaties. Love didn't buy soldiers. Marriage was currency, and everyone at court knew it. But here's where it gets messy. Because while marriages were set in stone, hearts weren't. Kings, queens, princes, they were human. And humans have a funny way of wandering outside the lines. While the crown wanted predictable unions, reality gave them temptation, passion, and rumor. And rumor, in medieval courts, was more dangerous than a sharpened blade. Let's start with the kings, who acted like chess masters. arranging marriages for their children as though they were moving pawns across a board. Take a king who marries off his daughter to a neighboring duke, not for love, but for his army of knights, or his son to a princess who brings with her a rich dowry enough to fund a decade of wars. These marriages weren't romances. They were investments, stocks traded in flesh and blood. Now, imagine being a young royal in that world. Your father hands you a name, a title. A stranger Anne tells you this is who you'll spend the rest of your life with. For the good of the realm, no say, no choice, and heaven forbid you complain. Because to complain wasn't just rebellion against your father. It was rebellion against the entire kingdom. But here's the irony, and, oh, it's a delicious one. The very kings who orchestrated these ironclad matches were often the worst offenders when it came to breaking their own rules. They expected their sons and daughters to obey, to marry for politics, but themselves, well, temptation was harder to resist. A beautiful lady-in-waiting, a charismatic courtier, a forbidden partner who made them feel alive again. And when kings strayed, they opened the door to chaos, because in a world obsessed with bloodlines, every illegitimate child was a ticking time bomb. Was this boy truly the king's son, or a bastard born of scandal? Was this girl destined for marriage into another royal family, or doomed by whispers of illegitimacy? A crown balanced precariously on rumors could topple faster than a crumbling wall. Now, let's lean into the double standard. It's almost comical if it weren't so deadly serious. Royals were told, from the moment they could walk, that their bodies weren't their own. Their love lives were prepackaged, their marriages preordained, and yet if they dared to follow their heart outside the contract, boom. Scandal. Imagine being told exactly who to marry for politics, and then being scolded for daring to fall in love on your own time. That was the game, and scandal didn't stay quiet. Courtiers thrived on gossip. A whispered rumor at a banquet could spread across kingdoms by dawn. The king favors her. The queen lingers too long with him. Did you see who slipped out of whose chamber last night? Every glance, every smile, every laugh could spark wildfire. And wildfire didn't care about treaties. It consumed them. Let's not forget the stakes. These weren't harmless affairs. A rumor of illegitimacy could disinherit a prince. A scandalous love could unravel alliances painstakingly tied together through marriage contracts. A king's reputation could collapse under the weight of whispers. And when kings fell, kingdoms followed. But here's the contradiction that makes it all so absurd. For all the moralizing, for all the strictness, romance wasn't entirely banned. In fact, a little passion, carefully managed, discreetly ignored, was tolerated, even celebrated, as long as it didn't threaten the throne. Kings could have mistresses, as long as they remembered their duty to their queen. Queens could sometimes indulge, as long as their affairs never tainted the line of succession. Love was tolerated, like wine enjoyed in moderation, but dangerous if you drank too deeply, crossed the invisible line, though. And romance became royal dynamite. Picture a king who falls not just into bed with a mistress, but into her arms completely. He starts showering her with gifts, giving her influence over court decisions, hinting that his children with her matter more than his official heirs. Suddenly, nobles panic, councils convene, the court trembles. Because this isn't a fling anymore. This is a threat. Or picture a queen caught in an affair. The father of her child questioned. Overnight, the stability of the dynasty is shattered. Nobles sharpen daggers. Enemies circle like wolves. Because if the heir is not truly royal, the entire kingdom loses its foundation. That was the medieval reality. Marriage was tolerated when it was duty. Love was tolerated when it was discreet. But when love crossed that invisible line, when it touched the throne, the bloodline, the inheritance, it became deadly, and everyone knew it. That's why the courts of Europe buzzed like hives of paranoia. Why chroniclers wrote with quills dipped in discretion. Why lovers whispered in gardens and scribbled letters in code. Everyone played the game, balancing between duty and desire, politics and passion. But sooner or later, someone always stumbled. Someone always loved too much or too openly. And when they did, the whispers began. The rumors spread, and scandal, once lit, was nearly impossible to extinguish. This is the contrast we need to hold in our minds as we move deeper. The cold, calculated business of arranged royal marriages, set against the fiery, unpredictable passion of forbidden love. The respectable facade versus the dangerous truth. Because in the medieval world, acceptable romance was boring, predictable, safe, but forbidden romance. That was dynamite. That was the spark that could topple thrones, shatter treaties, and rewrite history. And the kings knew it. The queens knew it. The courtiers whispered it. And the people sang it in ballads that outlived the very monarchs who tried to silence them. So, as we step out of this first act of the build-up, keep this contrast sharp in your mind. On one side, duty. On the other, desire. On one side, crowns and contracts. On the other, hearts and whispers. And it's in that dangerous space, between acceptable and forbidden, that the most explosive stories were born. Now, let's step inside. Into the glittering, dangerous heart of the medieval world, the royal court. On the surface, it was dazzling. Gold and jewels. Feasts that groaned under the weight of roasted boars and sugared fruits. Minstrels strumming, dancers twirling, nobles whispering, sweet compliments behind jeweled masks. A place of beauty, elegance, and ritual. But beneath the sparkle, treachery, a hive crawling with eyes and ears, because in the court, nothing was private, nothing. Every corridor held servants moving silently with trays. Every banquet was lined with advisors, each listening for secrets disguised as laughter. Foreign envoys lingered in corners, watching, reporting back across borders. And rivals made it their business to notice everything. One too long glance, one brush of the hand, one poorly timed smile. That was enough to spark whispers that could ruin a life. Royal love wasn't just romance, it was surveillance. Now, picture this, the grand wedding of a prince and princess. A stage performance with the kingdom as its audience. Banners flutter, trumpets blare, the vows are spoken. Everyone claps, drinks, and toasts to eternal love. But everyone knows it's theater. A script performed because it had to be. The real story begins afterward, behind the curtains, where duty ends and desire sneaks in through the shadows. Because while public vows kept up appearances, the truth of court life was messier. Behind the scenes, mistresses, lovers, forbidden trysts, carried out in alcoves, gardens, and chambers. Love letters passed through trembling hands of servants who prayed they wouldn't be caught. It wasn't so different from high school, really. Cliques, gossip, rivalries. Only these cliques carried swords. And instead of detention, you got exile. Or worse, the court was a stage, yes, but it was also a trap. A claustrophobic space where hundreds of people lived in constant proximity. And when you cram ambitious nobles, fragile egos, and the irresistible pull of romance into one place, sparks fly. Everyone wanted to be noticed. Everyone wanted to be important. And love, or even the appearance of love, was one of the most powerful currencies of all. For kings, mistresses could serve as political pawns. For queens, confidants could become lifelines. For courtiers, catching the monarch's eye even fleetingly could. And for rivals, that same eye contact was the perfect weapon. Did you see how the king looked at her? Did you notice how the queen lingered when he bowed? Surely something is going on. These whispers traveled faster than any horse. But here's the part that makes it almost comical. Everyone knew the truth. Everyone. Chroniclers, servants, nobles, even jesters. But the truth was both everywhere and nowhere. Why? Because writing it down was dangerous. Dangerous for the chronicler. Dangerous for the subject. Dangerous for the balance of power. So, chroniclers forgot things. They conveniently left out embarrassing details. Or they blurred them into vague suggestions just enough for future generations to squint and wonder. Some chroniclers were bribed. Others were threatened. Still others had their quills, guided by loyalty to their patrons. So the records we have today, half truth, half silence, carefully curated, a censored version of reality. But the silences spoke volumes. When a chronicle skips a year, when a letter is destroyed, when a name is missing, that absence screams louder than words ever could. And the court knew it, which is why secrecy was a full-time job. Lovers relied on maids, stewards, and confidants to carry letters, to guard doors, to swear loyalty under pain of death. Yet those same confidants could flip, could betray, could sell secrets for a handful of coins or the promise of a title. Imagine the paranoia. Every glance could be treason. Every smile could be temptation. Every rumor could be a trap. Now, think about the claustrophobia of that world. You live in a palace, yes, grand halls, gardens, tapestries, but it's also a cage. You're never alone. You're never unwatched. Even in your own chambers, servants come and go. Even in the gardens, spies lurk in shadows. How do you love in a place like that? Carefully, recklessly, secretly, and always with fear in your chest. Let's pause on that thought, because while we laugh about court gossip being like high school drama, the stakes were far higher. A bad rumor in high school might ruin your popularity. In court, it could cost you your crown or your head. And kings knew this, which is why so much of court life was built around performance. Banquets, dances, processions, all designed to show stability, loyalty, unity, to drown whispers in spectacle. But whispers never die. They just hide. Take a feast, for example. Hundreds of nobles gathered, the king and queen seated on thrones. The food arrives, the music swells, the toasts begin. On the surface, unity. beneath it, eyes darting, secrets simmering, alliances shifting with every exchanged glance. It was theater, layered on theater, a court constantly pretending to be something it wasn't. And in that theater, love was both the most intoxicating act and the most dangerous lie. So let's ask the question: how much of what we know today about royal affairs is real? And how much was rumor carefully planted by rivals? How many queens were actually guilty? How many kings actually in love? And how many were simply victims of a court that thrived on scandal, whether true or not? Because in a place where ambition ruled, gossip was the sharpest weapon of all. You didn't need a sword to destroy someone, just a whisper, just a rumor slipped into the right ear at the right time. And that's the claustrophobic brilliance of medieval courts. They turned love something natural, something human, to a weapon, into a test, into a trap. By the end of this glimpse inside the palace, we're left with a chilling truth. Royal love was never private. It was never safe. It was never just about two people. It was about everyone, every servant, every noble, every rival, every chronicler who decided what to write and what to erase. The court was a glittering stage, but also a pressure cooker of fear and desire, where every glance mattered, where every smile could be fatal, and where love, real, dangerous love, was both everywhere and nowhere at once. Now we slip into the shadows, away from the throne rooms, away from the banquets, into the hidden corners where forbidden love took root and dared to grow. Because love in the medieval world wasn't just dangerous, it was an act of espionage. And like any secret mission, it needed strategy, courage, and a whole lot of luck. Picture this: a torchlit hallway, the stone walls cold and damp. A young courtier moves quickly, her footsteps echoing, carrying a folded piece of parchment tucked beneath her cloak. A letter, not just words, but a heartbeat on paper. If she's caught, it's not just embarrassment, it's ruin, maybe death. But she walks anyway, because some secrets are worth the risk. This was the mechanics of secrecy. How romances began and survived under the noses of kings and queens who would sooner see them extinguished than exposed. Where did love stories spark? In the strangest of places. A fleeting glance during a banquet, a brush of hands while passing a goblet, eyes meeting too long during a dance, while the minstrels play and everyone pretends not to notice. Or perhaps during a hunt, royalty galloping through forests, the thunder of hooves masking whispered words. Or in chapel corners, where the irony was almost laughable, beneath painted saints and solemn prayers, lovers stole moments with each other. Religious ceremonies, baptisms, weddings, masses became some of the safest covers. Who would suspect two nobles exchanging vows to God were also exchanging silent promises with each other? Who would dare interrupt a queen kneeling in prayer, unaware that her folded hands hid a note slipped to her by a trembling maid? It sounds like a Netflix drama, doesn't it? But with more chainmail, less chill, and like any good drama, there were supporting characters. Love couldn't survive in secrecy without them. Loyal friends, discreet servants, and sometimes priests who turned a blind eye. They were the go-betweens, the lifelines, the messengers who smuggled letters, arranged meetings, and guarded doors. Imagine the pressure on them. One mistake, and they weren't just out of a job. They could be whipped, imprisoned, even executed. And yet, they risked it for loyalty, for money, for the thrill of being part of something bigger than themselves. Of course, not all were loyal. Some were bribed, some were blackmailed, and some, hungry for their own advancement, betrayed the very lovers they served. A jealous maid might slip a note into the wrong hands. A rival courtier might whisper the truth to the king. A bribe passed quietly might undo months of secrecy in an instant. And that was the terror of it all. Secrecy was never permanent. It was borrowed time, because the more elaborate the cover, the more eyes you needed to trust. The more letters exchanged, the more people handled them. The more meetings stolen, the more footsteps risked being heard. One slip, one rival, one enemy with sharper ears than expected. That was all it took for a romance to spiral into disaster. Picture two lovers meeting in a garden. The moonlight silver on the hedges. They whisper, they laugh, they promise the impossible. And then just out of sight, someone watches. Someone who sees, who hears, who files that information away like a dagger waiting to be unsheathed. Every romance was also a gamble, a game of chance, played with hearts, reputations, and lives. Now let's talk about the thrill. Because for all its danger, these clandestine romances carried a pulse of excitement unmatched by anything else in court life. Imagine being trapped in a world of rigid rules, stiff ceremonies, suffocating expectations. Then suddenly, you find someone who makes you feel alive, someone worth risking everything for. Every glance was electric, every touch a shockwave, every letter a treasure hidden away beneath pillows or tucked into sleeves. The risk made the feeling sharper, more intoxicating. But with that thrill came paranoia. Every laugh could be overheard. Every servant could be a spy. Every rival could be plotting to expose you. Lovers lived in constant fear, their passion burning brightly, while a shadow of dread followed every step. It's what made these romances both irresistible and unbearable. And here's the cruel irony. For all their efforts at secrecy, most affairs eventually slipped into the open. Sometimes it was carelessness, a misplaced letter, a glance too obvious at a banquet. Sometimes it was betrayal, a confidant flipping sides, a rival catching the scent of blood. And sometimes it was simply fate, the sheer impossibility of keeping love hidden forever in a world crawling with watchful eyes. And when exposure came, the fallout was brutal at best. Humiliation, whispers, spreading through the court like wildfire, reputations crumbling, alliances straining, at worst, exile, imprisonment, execution. That's why these stories still captivate us, because every forbidden romance was a balancing act between ecstasy and catastrophe, between whispers of passion and screams of betrayal, between life and death. Now let's step back into that paranoia. Imagine being a royal mistress, tucked away in chambers given to you by the king. Gifts surround you, jewels, silks, perfumes. You have power, influence, a place at the king's side. And yet, every knock at the door could be the one that ends it all. Every maid who bows could be the one who betrays you. Every smile hides a question. How long until they find out? Or imagine being a queen, expected to embody virtue, loyalty, purity. Yet your heart belongs to another. You meet him in stolen moments, your hands brushing in passing, your words disguised as casual greetings. But in your mind, you know, if this is discovered, it won't just destroy you. It could unravel the entire kingdom. That's the weight of secrecy. So let me ask, what would you do? Would you take the risk? Would you gamble everything for love, knowing that one mistake could cost you your life? That's the eternal question, isn't it? It's why these stories linger, because we're drawn to the madness of it, the desperation, the willingness to risk crowns, thrones, dynasties, for one fleeting taste of passion. And that's why kings feared it so much, because forbidden love wasn't just about two people breaking rules. It was about the instability it created, the questions it raised, the possibility that entire kingdoms could topple from a secret hidden in a garden, or a kiss stolen in a chapel. By the end of this glimpse, we understand the heartbeat of these romances. They weren't just love stories. They were high-stakes thrillers. They were whispered conspiracies. They were tragedies waiting to be written. And that's why we're still fascinated. Because secrecy never lasts. And when it breaks, history shifts. So, hold on to that thought. Because the stories to come, the betrayals, the discoveries, the punishments will show us just how fragile and how dangerous forbidden love really was. Whispers, that's how it always began. A murmur at a banquet table, a servant's slip of the tongue, a glance too long between the wrong pair of eyes. At first, it was harmless. Everyone pretended not to notice. Everyone played along with the theater of silence. But whispers never stay whispers for long. Because in the pressure cooker of medieval courts, secrets weren't kept. They fermented, they grew. And when they burst, they didn't just embarrass lovers, they reshaped kingdoms. Picture this, a love letter slipped beneath a pillow, written in hurried ink, sealed with trembling wax, meant for one set of eyes only. But somehow, mysteriously, it's found in the hands of a rival. Suddenly, it's not just a letter, it's a weapon in medieval politics. A love letter could be deadlier than a sword, and the court knew it. One exposed affair could tip alliances, fracture loyalties, and ignite chaos. What began as a private indulgence, the thrill of a midnight tryst, the sweetness of a hidden smile, morphed into a public crisis once revealed. Nobles picked sides. Some rallied around the king, insisting his lover was harmless. Others fumed, furious at the influence she or he held. Foreign allies watched with raised eyebrows. Was this monarch trustworthy, or was he blinded by passion, incapable of leading? The stakes were enormous, because scandal didn't just stain reputations, it rewrote politics. Chroniclers, who once had carefully forgotten details, suddenly found their pens unstoppable. They wrote with zeal, cataloging every rumor, every accusation, every downfall. Why? Because scandal was irresistible. Scandal sold. And once a story became too big to bury, no king, no queen, no bribe could silence it. Think about the irony. For years, chroniclers censored themselves, omitting names, erasing details, tearing out pages. But once a secret slipped into the open, their restraint vanished. Suddenly, they wrote like gossip columnists with divine inspiration. And their words, those carefully inked accusations, outlasted stone castles and golden crowns. The affair became not just a scandal, but a political earthquake. Lovers once cherished in private became pawns in a public war. A mistress, elevated above her station, could divide the nobility. A favorite companion of the king could spark jealousy so fierce it turned into armed rebellion. Imagine the shockwaves in a royal family. A queen humiliated by her husband's open infidelity might seek allies of her own. A prince whose parents' scandal tainted his legitimacy might find his very right to rule questioned. Brothers, uncles, cousins, they all circled, waiting for a chance to exploit the fracture, and foreign powers, they pounced, because nothing weakened a kingdom faster than domestic scandal. A king in love was a king distracted. A court divided was a court vulnerable. Enemies didn't always need armies. Sometimes they only needed a rumor, and those rumors, oh, they spread like wildfire. Picture the gossip trails, from noble dining halls to merchants' stalls, from whispered letters across borders to ballads sung in taverns. What began as a secret affair in the palace could be sung mockingly in the streets within weeks. Because once love escaped into scandal, they no longer controlled the story. They couldn't burn every letter. They couldn't silence every bard. They couldn't bribe every chronicler. The story had wings and it flew far beyond the palace gates. And here lies the delicious irony. The very thing kings feared most, more than their victories ever did. A king might win battles, build cathedrals, expand his realm. Yet centuries later, what do we remember? Not the treaties, not the tax reforms. We remember the scandal, the lover, the affair that exploded into crisis. That's the cruel poetry of history. Now imagine the mood in the court once a scandal broke. The silence gone. The whispers turned into shouts. Nobles divided into camps. Letters flying, meetings held in secret, daggers sharpened. The once carefully balanced chessboard of dynasties suddenly overturned because someone loved too much, too openly, or too recklessly. Every step became dangerous. Every move under scrutiny. The queen's expression, the king's absence from a feast, the presence of a certain Ladior Lordin, the royal chamber. Everything meant something. Everything was interpreted, exaggerated, twisted. The paranoia was suffocating, and yet people couldn't look away, because scandal was addictive. It was thrilling. It was the one time the mighty looked fragile, the untouchable looked human. It was also the one time chroniclers dropped their caution and let themselves write with relish. Let's not underestimate their power. These men, sitting with ink-stained fingers, decided how stories lived. And once scandal gave them an opening, they filled their pages with details, embellished, perhaps, exaggerated, definitely. But true or not, the story stuck, and once written, it could never be unwritten. So scandals became part of the architecture of history itself. And here's the irony that makes it unforgettable. Forbidden love, hidden in shadows for years, became eternal the moment it was exposed. What lovers feared most, discovery, was also their ticket to immortality. By the end of this build-up, the stage is set. We've seen how love began in whispers, grew in secrecy, and finally collided with brutal politics. We've seen how private indulgence became public spectacle, how rumor turned into rebellion, how affection turned into ammunition. The tension is unbearable because we know what comes next. The explosion, the conflict, the betrayal, the moment when secrecy dies and scandal lives forever. So take a breath, because the stories ahead, the scandals too big to bury. The punishments too cruel to forget will show us just how deadly forbidden love could be. Let's begin with the first wave of scandal, the mistress. Now, don't be fooled into thinking a royal mistress was just a secret lover, tucked away in silk sheets for a king's private indulgence. Oh no. In the medieval world, a mistress could be more dangerous than an army. Why? Because she had influence. And in a court where access was everything, influence was the deadliest currency of all. Picture this: a king, weary from councils, tired of squabbling nobles, retreating to his private chambers. And there, waiting for him, is not just a lover, but an advisor in disguise. Someone who whispers in his ear not just words of affection, but words of persuasion. A suggestion here, a warning there. Perhaps don't trust that duke. Perhaps give this man the command. Perhaps this treaty is not in your favor. And just like that, the bedroom becomes the battlefield, because decisions weren't always made in throne rooms or war councils. Sometimes they were made between pillows. Imagine your country's future hinging on who got the most pillow talk time with the king. Terrifying, isn't it? But it happened over and over. Some mistresses wielded power like a hidden dagger. They manipulated court appointments, swayed royal decrees, even tipped the balance of war. A nod from the king could elevate a family overnight, and many courtiers knew the surest way to that nod was through her. Naturally, this made mistresses both envied and despised. Rivals painted them as witches. Enemies accused them of poisoning the king's mind. Whispers, spread of spells, charms, love potions, anything to explain why a king would favor one woman so completely. Because surely it couldn't just be love. Surely it had to be sorcery. Convenient, isn't it? If a woman was powerful, she must have been unnatural. And this suspicion made mistresses perfect scapegoats. When wars went badly, blame the mistress. When taxes crushed the people, blame the mistress. When the king ignored his counsel, blame the mistress. It was political theater, and the mistress was often cast as the villain. But here's the dangerous truth. Some of them leaned into that power. They weren't fools. They knew the risks. They knew every rival in the court would happily see them ruined, disgraced, or executed. And yet, they played the game. They used their influence, not just for jewels or estates, but for strategy. They placed allies in key positions. They whispered against enemies. They built networks of loyalty that stretched far beyond the royal bedchamber. And in doing so, they blurred the line between passion and politics, between private pleasure and public power. Think about the paranoia that caused. Nobles who once jockeyed for the king's attention now had to win over his lover. Foreign envoys, desperate for treaties, courted the mistress's favor as much as the king's. Suddenly, she was not just a woman in silk. She was the gatekeeper to the crown. That terrified people, because if the mistress could sway the king, what else could she do? Could she drag the kingdom into war? Could she ruin a noble house with a single complaint? Could she influence the very succession of the throne? The answer was often yes, and so the stakes grew higher. Every mistress lived under a storm cloud of suspicion and jealousy. For every admirer, she had 10 enemies sharpening daggers behind her back. Imagine the court atmosphere. Nobles muttering, "She bewitched him." Advisors warning, "The kingdom suffers under her spell." priests condemning from pulpits. This is sin, and sin will destroy us. And yet the king kept her close, because desire is stronger than sermons, affection louder than politics. This is where the suspense grows unbearable, because every mistress was a potential kingmaker or a potential scapegoat. When times were good, she was untouchable, draped in jewels, gifted estates, her family elevated beyond their station. But when fortune turned, she was the first to fall, a famine. Blame her, a lost battle. Blame her, a poor harvest, a rebellion, a tax revolt. Blame her. Mistresses became lightning rods for every grievance, convenient targets for hatred that might otherwise fall upon the king himself. And many met grim ends: exile, imprisonment, sometimes execution, cloaked in accusations of treason, witchcraft, or immorality. Their names blackened in chronicles, their reputations smeared for centuries. But others survived. Some even thrived. They outmaneuvered rivals, sidestepped blame, and clung to power long after common sense said they should have been destroyed. And those women became legends, because the role of mistress wasn't passive. It was active, dangerous, and intoxicating. It was standing on a knife's edge, balancing between desire and destruction. Now, let's ask the question plainly. Were these women truly manipulative? Or were they simply survivors, playing the only hand available to them in a world designed to silence them? Maybe both. What we know for certain is this: mistresses weren't just lovers. They were players in the deadliest game on earth. And in a medieval court, that meant their influence could shift the fate of kingdoms. Picture again that bedchamber. The king reclines, weary. The mistress leans close, her voice soft. She whispers a name. The next morning, that man is promoted. Another name. The next day, that rival is exiled. The stakes of pillow talk could be life and death, and the nobles knew it, which is why they schemed endlessly, not just to win the king's ear but hers. Gifts sent to her chambers, flattery whispered in her presence, alliances forged not through treaties, but through her favor. And when she refused, when she turned her power against them, they struck back with venom, rumors, slanders, whispers of witchcraft, of poison, of treason. That was the cycle. Desire, influence, suspicion, scandal, and the kingdom trembled under it. By the time we finish this first wave of scandal, one truth is clear. A mistress was never just a mistress. She was a force. She was a risk. She was a woman standing in the eye of a political hurricane, powerful enough to shape history and vulnerable enough to be destroyed by it. And every time she whispered in the king's ear, the fate of a kingdom shifted. Now we turn to the affairs that didn't just stir gossip. They stirred rebellion. Affairs so consuming, so public, that they didn't just threaten reputations. They threatened the very stability of kingdoms. And at the center of this storm stands one of the most infamous royal entanglements in medieval history: King Edward II of England and his beloved companion, Piers Gaveston. Picture England in the early 14th century. The barons restless, the treasury stretched thin, a king still young, eager to assert his authority. And into this fragile landscape walks Piers Gaveston, a knight of charisma, charm, and a flair for the dramatic dot. Edward adored him. That much is undeniable. Whether their bond was romantic, platonic, or something more complicated. It was intense, obsessive, unshakable. Edward showered Gaveston with titles, lands, and honors, usually reserved for men of much higher birth. He placed him at the center of power. He feasted with him. He laughed with him. He leaned on him more than on his own counsel, and the nobles, they seethed. Imagine being a powerful baron, descended from generations of warriors, expecting influence over your king, but instead, king's ear day and night. That resentment grew poisonous. The nobles whispered behind banners, muttering in corridors, gathering in hunting lodges to plot. What was this favoritism? What spell had Gaveston cast over the king? Why did Edward seem blind to the needs of his realm, but utterly devoted to this one man? The more the king exalted Gaveston, the more furious the barons became. Now, let's be honest. Medieval politics was brutal. A misplaced smile could cost you a fortune. An insult at a feast could spark a feud lasting generations. And Edward didn't make things easier. He flaunted his affection for Gaveston. He paraded him at tournaments. He seated him at banquets in places of honor meant for nobles of far greater status. It was like poking a hornet's nest while grinning ear to ear, apparently. Feasting your favorite knight while ignoring your barons was the medieval equivalent of unfollowing the wrong person on Twitter. Except instead of passive-aggressive subtweets, you got armed rebellion. The barons demanded Gaveston's removal. Again and again, they forced Edward to exile him. And again, Edward brought him back. No sooner was Gaveston shipped off than he returned, welcomed like a prodigal son, draped in new titles and rewards. The cycle repeated. Each return a slap in the face to the nobility. Each reconciliation a deeper fracture in the kingdom's fragile unity. It wasn't just favoritism anymore. It was war bait. Finally, the nobles had enough. They united, a coalition of resentment, and declared Gaveston an enemy of the realm. Not just an annoyance, not just a distraction, an enemy. And in a moment that feels ripped from a tragic drama, they captured him. Picture it. Gaveston, once glittering in the king's company, now a prisoner in their hands. The nobles debated his fate, execution, exile again. Could they risk another return? They chose blood. Piers Gaveston was executed in 1312, dragged from the center of royal favor to the edge of disgrace, and finally to his death. And Edward, heartbroken, furious, but helpless. His personal devotion had fueled rebellion, and his kingdom teetered in the aftermath. This wasn't just the story of a king and his companion. It was the story of how love or loyalty or obsession can clash with politics so violently that the ground shakes beneath an entire realm. Because that's the lesson. When a king puts personal love above political duty, the consequences ripple far beyond bedrooms and banquets. They ripple into council chambers, onto battlefields, into the very fabric of a nation. Edward's devotion to Gaveston left scars on his reign. It fractured trust with his nobles. It weakened his authority. It sowed chaos that would haunt his rule for years to come. And yet, can you really blame him? In a world where marriages were contracts and politics smothered every choice, Edward found someone he cherished, someone he trusted, someone who made him feel alive. But kings don't get to be human, not fully, not without consequence. And that's the tragedy. Because, for all the jokes, For all the sarcasm about medieval favoritism, the undertone is deadly serious. One relationship, whether romantic or not, nearly toppled a kingdom, and Edward II was hardly alone. Across courts in Europe, kings and princes stumbled into the same trap, elevating favorites, ignoring nobles, letting love or infatuation or sheer stubborn devotion blind them to duty. And every time the kingdom paid the price. So ask yourself, what's more dangerous? A foreign army at the gates, or a king in love with the wrong person? For the nobles of Edward's court, the answer was clear. Love was the greater threat, because love is unpredictable. Love doesn't listen to treaties. Love doesn't respect bloodlines or hierarchies. Love makes kings defy their councils, rewrite laws, wage wars, and ignore warnings. And that's why love, in the medieval world, was feared as much as any sword. By the end of Gaveston's tragic tale, the message is unavoidable. Forbidden love wasn't just gossip. It wasn't just scandal. It was dynamite, powerful enough to split a kingdom in two. And if Edward II's story shows us anything, it's that one man's devotion, however sincere, can echo across generations. But as rebellion now, we step into the darkest chapter. The chapter where love doesn't just wither, turns lethal. Because in the medieval world, betrayal was never far away. Lovers who once whispered promises in gardens ended up whispering accusations in dungeons. The hand that once held yours could just as easily sign your death warrant. Picture this: a candle guttering in a drafty hall, a secret letter clutched in trembling hands, and then a door creaks open. Not the lover expected, but a guard, a rival, someone who knows what that letter means. In an instant, devotion becomes evidence, affection becomes ammunition, and love becomes treason. That was the reality. Lovers weren't just partners in passion. They were pawns in a larger game. And pawns are sacrificed first. Sometimes betrayal was survival. A queen's confidant, once sworn to secrecy, suddenly faced with torture, blurting out every detail to save her own skin. A servant, once loyal, bribed with gold and titles to betray the couple she protected. A knight, once devoted, realizing his future depended not on love, but on stepping away from it, tanned, condemning the one who trusted him most. Other times, betrayal was ambition. A lover deciding that the crown mattered more than passion, turning on the partner who gave them everything in exchange for influence, power, or simply the smug relief of self-preservation. It sounds dramatic, but this was the heartbeat of court life, because secrets never stayed secrets for long. Letters were found, sometimes intercepted by rivals who tore them open, laughing at the incriminating words, sometimes lost by servants who delivered them into the wrong hands. And those words, once written in passion, became daggers pointed straight at the heart of a romance. Imagine the horror of a queen realizing her private letter, signed with trembling love, is now being read aloud in council chambers, treated as evidence of treason. Or a king's mistress, her endearments mocked by enemies who will use them to ruin her forever. And once the rumors spread, they spread like wildfire. The medieval court was a furnace of gossip, and betrayal was its favorite fuel. Accusations, flurial or invented. And truth mattered less than who spoke first, who shouted loudest, who carried the sharper pen. But betrayal didn't just come in whispers. It came in steel. Picture a midnight corridor, the shuffle of boots on stone, a figure dragged from her chambers, her screams echoing down the hall, or a man pulled from his bed, his lover watching helpless as he's hauled away to a dungeon cell. Passion turned prison, love turned execution order, and in the darkest tales, betrayal ended in poison, a chalice offered with a smile, hiding death in its sweetness. A feast where only one plate carried the fatal dose. Lovers accused of treachery were often silenced before they could protest, because dead lips can't speak in their own defense. It's almost ironic, isn't it? What began as passion, pure and overwhelming, so often ended with cold iron chains, with exile, with death in the medieval playbook of love. Happily ever after usually came with an axe. The cruelty of betrayal lay not only in the punishment, but in the intimacy of it. Lovers didn't just fall to enemies, they fell to each other. Once devoted hearts turning cold, once joined hands pulling apart, one pointing to the other as guilty. And sometimes it wasn't even betrayal at all, just the appearance of it. Accusations were easy weapons. If a rival wanted to discredit you, what better way than to claim you were unfaithful, that you had betrayed your king, your queen, your country? One whispered lie could bring down entire households. But whether true or false, the outcome was often the same: destruction. Picture dungeon cells, dripping with damp, where once proud lovers now huddle in chains. Picture execution scaffolds, where trembling voices cry out innocence before the axe falls. Picture noble families exiled, their lands seized, because their daughter loved too boldly or their son strayed too recklessly. And yet, for all the tragedy, there's a grim fascination to it, because betrayal adds a sharp edge to passion. It makes every embrace seem doomed, every kiss laced with the possibility of death. That tension is why these stories endure. They weren't neat fairy tales. They were bloody, chaotic, human, and they remind us of the cruel irony of power. The higher you rose, the harder you fell. A peasant caught in an affair might suffer gossip. A king, a queen, a noble. They risked everything: thrones, dynasties, lives. So betrayal wasn't an accident of love. It was baked into it, inevitable. Because in a world where desire clashed with politics, love was never safe, never private, and never guaranteed to last. One day, you're whispering promises under the stars. The next, you're accused of treason. One day, your confidant is your lifeline. The next, she's an informant. One day, your lover is your shield. The next, he's your executioner. That was the rhythm. That was the risk. So let me ask you, would you risk it? Would you gamble your life, your family's safety, your very legacy, for the thrill of a forbidden romance? Many did, and many paid the price. But even in their downfall, even in betrayal, their stories survived. Because betrayal makes for unforgettable tragedy. And in the cruel theater of medieval courts, tragedy was the most reliable entertainment of all. By the time we leave this chapter, the message is clear. Love in the medieval world was never just love. It was power, it was danger, it was a gamble, with death always lurking in the wings, and betrayal. Betrayal was the closing act. Now we turn to the murkiest part of the story, the place where truth and lies blur together, where love becomes legend, and legend becomes weapon. Because in the medieval world, forbidden romances didn't just happen. They were told, retold, twisted, and sometimes entirely invented. Were these kings really in love? Were these queens truly unfaithful? Or were jealous rivals sharpening their pens, ready to turn affection into scandal? Picture this: a monk hunched over his manuscript, candlelight flickering across his ink-stained fingers. He pauses, his quill hovering. Does he write the truth he overheard? Or does he write what his patron, some powerful lord, wants him to say? Does he preserve a romance? Or does he bury it beneath accusations and moral lessons? That decision could shape history, and that's the point. Chroniclers weren't neutral. They weren't historians in the modern sense. They were political players. Their loyalty was bought, bribed, or bullied. They wrote what served power, and love stories. Love stories made excellent weapons. Say you wanted to discredit a king. Easy. You whispered that he was enslaved by passion, that he ignored his duties, blinded by a mistress or an unworthy favorite. You painted him as weak, corrupt, unmanly, and suddenly his authority crumbled. Or maybe you wanted to strike at a queen. Even easier. Accuse her of infidelity. Suggest that the heir was illegitimate. In a world obsessed with bloodlines, that rumor was nuclear. One whispered lie could unravel a dynasty, basically. Fake news was thriving centuries before Twitter, and it spread just as fast. Illuminated manuscripts carried the words. Priests repeated them in sermons. Minstrels wove them into songs that peasants hummed while working the fields. Once a rumor was out, you couldn't control it. It lived in ink, in voices, in memory. And here's the suspense. How much of what we know today is actually true? Take Edward II again. Was his bond with Gaveston truly a passionate romance? Or was it exaggerated, twisted by nobles who needed an excuse to hate him? Did chroniclers record fact, or propaganda sharpened into a dagger? Or take Eleanor of Aquitaine, accused of affairs that may never have existed. Was she really guilty, or was she simply too powerful, too independent, and therefore a perfect target? The frustrating and fascinating answer is that we'll never fully know, because the medieval record is not a mirror. It's a funhouse mirror, bending and warping, reflecting agendas rather than realities. And yet, the warped version is what survives. Imagine walking through a library of crumbling manuscripts, some pages intact, others scratched out. Names erased, stories deliberately cut short. You run your fingers across the parchment and see faint letters beneath the scraping ghosts of stories someone tried to destroy. Was that a true account of love, or a lie someone wanted forgotten? That's the haunting beauty of these myths. We don't know where truth ends and rumor begins, and that uncertainty that hazes exactly what makes them so powerful, because myths live longer than facts. Myths grow in the telling. Myths sink their claws into memory, refusing to let go. Think of the chroniclers as medieval spin doctors. If a king wanted to appear holy, they emphasized his piety. If he wanted to bury a scandal, they skipped entire years of his reign. If his enemies wanted to smear him, suddenly the chronicles overflowed with tales of lust, sin, and weakness. And for the public, that was history. No one fact-checked the monk in the scriptorium. No one demanded sources from the court poet. The story was the story. And if it was scandalous enough, it stuck forever. Now pause. Ask yourself, how many of the love stories we find so irresistible today were, in fact, inventions, carefully crafted lies to entertain, to shame, to destroy? It doesn't even matter, because once the ink dried, the story lived. And kings feared that. They feared the story more than the act. A fling could be hidden, a romance denied, but once it became a tale, once it spread through chronicles, songs, gossip, it was unstoppable. That's why propaganda mattered as much as politics. Imagine a queen accused of an affair. She may be innocent, she may even prove it, but the accusation alone plants doubt. Nobles whisper, allies hesitate. Foreign courts raise their eyebrows. The damage is done. Or a king accused of weakness because of his devotion to a mistress. Maybe he was strong, capable, ruthless in governance. But if the story painted him as soft, distracted, emasculated, his enemies could use that against him. Words became daggers. Rumors became battles. Myths became weapons sharper than steel. And centuries later, those weapons still gleam, because when we open a history book today, we're often reading not truth, but propaganda polished by time. We repeat the scandals. We marvel at the forbidden romances. We shake our heads at the weakness of kings and the cunning of mistresses. But deep down, we know some of it is smoke. Some of it is mirrors. Some of it was invented for political gain. And yet, doesn't that make the stories even more irresistible? Because we're not just chasing history. We're chasing shadows. We're chasing the gossip of centuries, preserved like fossils in ink and song. That's the suspense that lingers over every forbidden love tale. Was it true? Was it twisted? Or was it fabricated entirely by a chronicler, paid in coin and flattery? We'll never know for sure. And that uncertainty is exactly what keeps us coming back. So by the end of this chapter, one truth stands out. In the medieval world, love was dangerous, not only in life, but in memory. The act could be punished, yes, but the story, the rumor, the myth, the propaganda was immortal. And once it was told, no king, no queen, no army could erase it. And now, the stakes rise to their highest dot, because every secret affair had an inevitable question looming over it. What happens when you're caught? In the medieval world, discovery didn't just mean embarrassment. It meant exile. It meant forced separation. It meant prison cells and scaffold platforms. Sometimes it meant the end of entire families, tainted forever by scandal. Picture this. Two lovers finally found out. Guards storming into chambers at midnight, torches flaring, steel drawn. One dragged away screaming, the other begging for mercy. Their letters seized, their names dragged through mud. Their fates sealed by men who had never loved them, but hated them enough to destroy them. That was the price of being caught. Exile was common. A lover whisked away to a distant monastery or an isolated castle, never to return. Sometimes, even the king himself would enforce it, banishing the very person he once adored, all to preserve appearances. Forced separations tore lives apart, leaving nothing but whispers in their wake. And when exile wasn't enough, execution, a beheading in a crowded square, a hanging on the castle green, a cup of wine laced with poison, delivered with false courtesy. Death became the ultimate punctuation mark to a love story the crown wanted erased. But here's the cruel irony. For all the punishments, for all the blood spilled, kings could never quite destroy the story. They tried. Oh, how they tried. Letters were burned, parchments thrown into fire, the ink curling into smoke. Portraits were slashed, destroyed, hidden in dusty vaults. Names were scratched from records. Entire chapters of chronicles left blank. Whole years vanished from the official histories because they contained a scandal too dangerous to admit. But silence is never absolute. Every burned letter left behind a memory in the heart of someone who once read it. Every slashed portrait left behind rumors of what it depicted. Every erased name created a hole that made people ask, who is missing? Ironically, the very act of censorship made the stories harder to forget, because the absence was louder than the presence. The missing page screamed louder than the written one. Imagine walking into a library of chronicles, only to find whole sections cut out, names scraped away. Don't you want to know why? Don't you immediately suspect the worst? That's exactly how scandal survived. What was meant to be hidden became immortalized, not in official records, but in whispers, rumors, and the imagination of those left to fill in the blanks. The people knew. They always knew. They told each other in taverns, in marketplaces, in fields. They sang songs about forbidden affairs long after the names were stricken from parchment. They carved jokes into walls. They remembered, even when kings commanded them to forget. And gossip was unstoppable. Kings could silence armies. They could crush rebellions. They could lock enemies in towers and throw away the keys. But gossip was invincible. Try to erase it, and it only grows stronger. Try to silence it, and it only shouts louder. A queen's lover executed. Suddenly, ballads about her morning sweep across villages. A mistress exiled. She becomes the heroine of a dozen whispered tales. A king ordering the destruction of letters. That act alone becomes proof of guilt in the minds of his subjects. The cover-up never killed the story. It gave it immortality, and that's why these scandals still echo centuries later. Because every attempt to erase them left behind a scar, a gap in the record, a hole in the truth that demanded to be filled. And human nature, it fills holes with stories. So now, these forbidden romances live on not as fairy tales, not as official histories, but as half-truths stitched together by rumor, exaggeration, and memory. They became tragedies, legends, warnings, and perhaps that was the greatest irony of all. Kings fought so hard to silence scandal, but in doing so, they guaranteed its survival. Think about it. No one remembers the exact number of taxes imposed in a king's reign. Few recall the endless wars or the names of every treaty signed, but we do remember the scandal. The lover dragged away, the queen accused. The names erased from pages, but never erased from whispers. That's the cruel poetry of history. By the end of this chapter, the stage is set. We've seen the passion. We've seen the secrecy. We've seen the betrayals and the propaganda. Now we've watched the punishments and the desperate cover dash-ups. But here's the chilling truth. None of it worked, because love that was meant to be hidden became eternal. A love story whispered in the dark now roars across centuries. A scandal once silenced now sings louder than any victory a king ever claimed. And so we pause here on the edge of the cliff. Because what comes next, the great reveals, the shocking twists, the punishments that couldn't be buried, will take us straight into the climax of this tale. Take a breath, because if you think exile, execution, and censorship were the end of the story, you haven't seen anything yet. And here it is, the moment everything collapses, because in the medieval world, forbidden love never stayed hidden forever. It always found a way into the light. Sometimes it was a rival's betrayal. Sometimes it was a careless word whispered to the wrong ear. Sometimes it was sheer arrogance, lovers convinced they could outwit a kingdom. But when discovery came, it came like a hammer. Picture this: midnight in a royal chamber. Candles flicker, shadows stretch across stone walls. Two lovers cling to each other, whispering promises, thinking the world is asleep. And then bang, the door bursts open. Soldiers flood in, swords gleaming, torches spitting sparks. Nobles push past them, smirks curling on their faces. And in that frozen heartbeat, romance is no longer secret, it's spectacle. Nothing says romance is over quite like soldiers barging in with swords drawn. From that moment, everything changes, because discovery wasn't just personal, it was political. The revelation of a forbidden affair didn't only break hearts, it broke kingdoms. A queen caught with a lover risked more than her crown. She risked her children's legitimacy, the very bloodline of the dynasty. If the heir could be questioned, the throne itself trembled. A king discovered with a mistress or worse, with a favorite who blurred the line between companion and beloved, handed his enemies the perfect weapon. Proof, they claimed, that he was weak, distracted, corrupted, and the court erupted. Whispers turned to shouts. Rivals leaped at the chance to humiliate their enemies. Families fractured, alliances crumbled. What began in whispers ended in civil war. Imagine the shock of courtiers, gasping as names they only dared mutter in gossip were suddenly shouted in council chambers. Imagine families tearing themselves apart, half defending the lovers, half calling for blood. Imagine the chaos of a court where the private bed became the public battlefield. It wasn't just the lovers who paid the price. Entire households went down with them. Servants accused of aiding the affair. Confidants suddenly exposed as accomplices. Brothers and sisters dragged into the scandal. Their reputations ruined forever. And the imagery burned itself into legend. Secret letters ripped from desks, seized by jealous rivals. Messages once sealed with wax, now read aloud in chambers filled with sneering nobles. Every "my love" or "my heart" transformed into evidence of treason. Bedchambers stormed by guards, their boots crushing tapestries and jewelry as they hauled away the guilty. Lovers torn apart in that single brutal moment, knowing they would never see each other again. And the faces pale as parchment, faces blazing with fury, faces twisted with shame. Discovery wasn't just an event, it was theater, and the entire kingdom got front row seats. But here's the sting. The moment of discovery was often engineered. Enemies waited for it. They set traps. They bribed servants to spy. They paid scribes to copy letters. They lurked in corridors, waiting for the slip of a lock, the rustle of sheets, the whispered sigh. And when the evidence was ready, they unleashed it with a flourish. Why storm in at midnight? Because spectacle mattered. Why parade the letters through council halls? Because humiliation mattered. Discovery wasn't just about truth, it was about power, about control, about crushing an opponent so completely they could never rise again, and every time it worked. One discovery could undo decades of power. One revelation could turn allies into enemies. One whisper shouted at the right time could collapse an entire dynasty. And yet, ironically, it was never the act itself that destroyed them. It was the exposure. As long as a secret remained a secret, even kings could look the other way. But once the affair was dragged into daylight, there was no saving it, no denying it, no covering it back up, because kingdoms could endure battles. They could endure famines. They could even endure incompetent rulers, but they could not endure scandal that mocked the throne. Discovery meant shame. Discovery meant the slow-motion implosion of everything the lovers thought they had secured, and the audience of history. Oh, it loved every second. Chroniclers scribbled furiously, delighted to record the downfall. Minstrels spun songs, mocking the guilty. Rival courts laughed, shaking their heads, secure in the knowledge that their enemies had destroyed themselves. It's almost cruel, almost comical. Imagine centuries later, a dusty manuscript surviving. You open it, and what's preserved? Not the laws, not the victories, not the treaties, but the scandal, the moment of exposure, the kiss that shouldn't have happened, the letter that should have burned, the night the guards burst in. That's what survived. That's what endured, because human memory is drawn to spectacle, and nothing was more spectacular than the forbidden love dragged screaming into daylight. So here, at the opening of the climax, we feel the raw shock of exposure. The thunder of doors breaking open, the gasps of nobles, the fury of betrayed families, the pale faces of lovers, realizing it's over, not just the romance, but everything. And as the dust settles, the stage is set, because discovery was never the end. It was only the beginning of the spiral. Punishment loomed. Cover-ups collapsed, rebellions stirred, and the story, now public, would only grow louder. So take a breath, hold it, because once the secret is out, there's no going back, and what comes next will be nothing less than catastrophic. And now, the hammer falls, the secrets are out, the whispers have turned into shouts, the doors have been kicked open. And the next step, punishment, because in the medieval world, discovery was never the end of the story. It was just the beginning of judgment. Picture this, a great hall, stone walls echoing with every sound. At the far end, a throne. On it sits a king, his face pale with fury, or maybe fear disguised as rage. Before him, the guilty lovers, who once whispered in the dark, now trembling in the light. Around them, nobles, rivals, servants, all watching, eager to see what justice will look like today. And justice was brutal. Exile was one of the kinder sentences. A mistress sent to a remote convent, forced to live out her days among stone walls and silence. A lover banished to some wind-swept border castle, cut off from power, from family, from everything that made life worth living. Imprisonment was worse. Dungeon cells dripping with damp, chains rubbing raw against wrists, darkness stretching into years. A punishment that wasn't death, but often felt worse. And then, of course, there was execution. Trials, if they happened at all, were swift, a performance rather than a search for truth. A scroll of charges read aloud, heads nodding solemnly, while everyone already knew the outcome. And then came the spectacle. Picture a scaffold in the town square, packed with crowds, hungry for drama. A trembling figure kneeling before the block, the swing of an axe, the silence before the cheer. Or a hanging, the rope creaking as the condemned swung while the crowd whispered their names for decades. Afterward, this was punishment, not just as retribution, but as theater. A reminder to every noble, every servant, every watching rival. This is what happens when love collides with power. But here's where the story takes a darker and sometimes stranger turn, because not every punishment worked as planned. Some mistresses, some lovers, some favorites, they survived. They adapted. They twisted scandal into leverage. Picture a mistress accused of leading the king astray. Nobles demand her exile. But instead of begging for mercy, she leans in. She whispers to the king that without her, he is alone.